Now that the communists were in charge of the new nation of the Soviet Union, they began to institute more direct policies. So, for instance, when Lenin first took over, he had what was called the New Economic Policy, or NEP. In that, he allowed some forms of capitalism, like private ownership, especially in agriculture. But once Stalin took over, he began collectivization of agriculture. The idea with collectivization is that private ownership was abolished. Now all those individual private farms would be pulled together into giant state-run farms. So the ones who resisted this the most were the Kulaks. The Kulaks were those entrepreneurial peasants who became successful farmers. They were able to buy and sell land and build their own businesses, and they would resist collectivization. Stalin basically believed that you either did what he wanted or you would starve. And during collectivization, it is estimated that 30 million Soviet citizens starved to death. And kind of one of the sad facts is, even though the Soviet Union has one of the great farmland, one of the richest soils, they never meet their agricultural goals. Mainly because there's no real incentive, which is a big issue with communism. When it's my farm, I don't mind pulling the weeds or doing the back-breaking labor of planting and sowing. But when it's the state's farm and it doesn't really matter how much it produces, I'm going to get paid the same small amount anyway, I'm not going to be incentivized to bust my tail as much. So rural reform was made out to be some type of great Soviet achievement. In fact, rural workers were often celebrated, as you see in this propaganda poster in the bottom left, of the rural sowers. But for the most part, people lived in giant apartment buildings and worked all day on farms that weren't theirs. And it resulted in mass starvation and the underperformance of Soviet agriculture. So I would say agriculture was always one weakness in the Soviet Union. But if you want to talk about a strength of the Soviet Union, it was industry. Stalin recognized that to be strong, they needed to increase the production of steel and coal. And the thing is, Russia's loaded with natural resources, but they needed workers and they needed factories. So with Stalin being a communist country in a command economy, it was far easier to plan the production of steel in industry. So Stalin began what he called his 5-year plans, which set goals where he wanted to see Soviet production. And these were a tremendous success. The other thing about it is Stalin and the Soviet Union glorified the worker. So, for instance, no matter what you wrote or pictures you painted or movies you made, they all had to glorify the worker. He's the real hero of the Soviet Union. It's known as socialist realism, the way socialists portray reality. It's truly an amazing piece of propaganda. But some great works in Soviet literature couldn't be published because they didn't portray the worker in a glorified manner. China would follow the Soviet model, both with the collectivization and redistributing land to the peasants, but also in industry. And except Mao is going to mess up industry by dividing it up. Instead of creating like massive cities like Magnitogorsk in the Soviet Union, which is known for producing steel, Mao would try to create small steel plants all over China, and it just didn't work. For instance, I know Pittsburgh is known as the Steel City because of the steel mills. Well, why is steel in Pittsburgh? You got 3 rivers for transportation and railroads for transportation. It's near both coal and iron deposits. It's just a perfect place for it. But Mao didn't really care about that. He just wanted, as he said, to bloom all over China. He was going to create many of these little steel plants in what he called his Great Leap Forward. Mao was good at giving things grandiose names like the Great Leap Forward, but they really didn't leap forward. So because these 5-year plans in the Soviet Union were successful, it gave a lot of confidence in central planning, the idea that you could plan the economy. The problem with planning the economy, and this is going to be a problem throughout the Soviet Union, is they could never estimate exactly how many consumer products they needed. So instead of having a surplus by producing too many, they'd always plan a shortage. And what that led to is long lines in order to purchase anything. So whenever you want or saw a line in the Soviet Union, you'd get in it because whatever it was they were selling, you knew you needed it. It could be meat, it could be toilet paper, it could be clothing, shoes. I mean, how in the world would you know that we need this style, size 9 black shoes in this amount? That's the problem with central planning. And that would be an issue, lack of consumer goods. Here's a good picture of Mao. I mean, the communists, like the Nazis before them, were amazing at propaganda. And here you see both men and women, marching and glorifying both industry, the man's holding up steel, and agriculture, the woman is holding up wheat. So you can see steel production does improve, but as I was telling you, Mao tended to use like these backyard steel furnaces, and they didn't really have the proper training, and it was a failure. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, something you should know is a big difference between Mao and the Soviets is Mao believed in continuous revolution, which basically meant if you didn't shake things up, what you'd eventually get is instead of equality, you would get one elite, like the Communist Party officials in the Soviet Union, and then everybody else. So what Mao liked to do is take everybody else and throw them above the elites, and he'd keep doing this, and the idea was it eventually would balance out to create true equality. But in reality, like for instance, when he took his peasants who worked in the farms in the countryside and moved them into the cities to work in industry, it was a disaster, like many of Mao's policies. There was a lot of paranoia in both the Soviet Union and China. There always had to be enemies. For instance, Stalin hated what he called Trotskyites. Trotsky was Lenin's right-hand man. Stalin would drive him and his followers out of the country. Trotsky fled to Mexico. Stalin had him hunted down, and somebody drove an ice pick through the back of his head and killed him. Stalin was always trying to keep people on edge with his terror, his great purges. Stalin killed anybody he thought was a threat to him. And he killed generals, he killed political leaders, he killed even very good communists. And even the ones he didn't kill, he'd send to gulags. Gulags are prison camps deep in Siberia, many of them above the Arctic Circle. His great purges in the 1930s, it's estimated that he killed 30 million people there. So with 30 million dying of his forced starvation, and another 30 million he killed. And as I mentioned, many of them were good communists, but his secret police were everywhere. And people would inform on their neighbors. Children would inform on their parents. Last night Dad said that Stalin was a knucklehead. And that night, there would be a knock at the door. Dad would be hauled away to a gulag. You wouldn't see him for 10 years. And the child that informed on their dad would receive a medal as a hero of the Soviet Union. China was even worse. Stalin and Mao probably killed more people than Hitler. Mao would wipe out a variety of people, including the upper class people that had been around prior to Stalin taking over. So you can see they thought it was kind of a cleansing. And even the ones that they didn't kill, they put them through what they called re-education. So you know what? You don't think properly. Let's teach you how to think. So when you look at socialism and communism, and you think of just the horrendous terror, death, destruction that they put it through, it gives a bad name to socialism. Keep in mind that these are communist countries. I always try to differentiate that socialism believes in the democratic process because a socialist looks at it that there's far more workers than there are factory owners. So just naturally, if you let them have elections, they're going to win the elections. Again, Mao, this is a picture of Mao in the Little Red Book. This came about during the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution. Another example of Mao shaking things up. He printed a red book, and it was about I think it was called like the 5 wrongs, wrong thinking. Anyway, the idea was, or the old way of thinking. He wanted to try to create a new way. So he had the students with the red books, and he discredited many of the old guard communists, including Deng Xiaoping, who was with him on the Long March. And they sent them out to work in the rice paddies or the wheat fields of rural China. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, Mao brought in farmers to work in the cities. Again, continuous revolution. This took place in the 1960s, the Red Book and the Great Proletariat Cultural Revolution. And really what it did, as I mentioned, it shook China up. It really destroyed their economic production, as you can well imagine. City factory workers don't do well in the countryside on farms and vice versa. And many good, knowledgeable communists were denounced. Even communist teachers would be denounced by their own students, who would wave the red book and say they were practicing an old way of thinking. So you didn't want to be accused of violating the olds. So the red book's a good example of Mao's continuous revolution. And we'll stop with that.